So I'm going to try to make this a quick run through of Ford and Carter. We know that Gerald Ford will come to office after the resignation, first of Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, due to a bribery scandal, and then Richard Nixon himself due to Watergate scandal. And then also Jimmy Carter, who will be elected after the presidency of Gerald Ford. So the Watergate scandal of the early 70s takes place in a decade that witnesses significant social, economic, and cultural changes. These changes contribute to a growing sense among Americans that something had gone wrong, that the nation had gone off track. There's just a sense of disquiet that is a part of the nation's political dialogue. Gerald Ford will be the 38th president of the United States, and we'll have to deal with something called stagflation, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Deficit spending. Deficit spending is debt. When you spend more money than you have. And we have been deficit spending since the Great Society, the Vietnam War, and suddenly we are going to have that deficit spending catch up to us in the form of inflation. We also have a bit of a perfect storm here with OPEC, which stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Country. They are going to announce an oil embargo on the United States in 1973. Oil will go from $3 a barrel in 1973 to $30 a barrel in 1980. And you can see these images here of cars and people lining up with gas cans to try to get gas because it was A, incredibly scarce, and B, incredibly expensive. American manufacturers are also going to struggle to keep pace with the rest of the world. It had been a while since American industrialists had updated their factories and processes. Imports will rise to historic levels. We are not buying American. Factories are forced to lay off workers. And this is where the idea of stagflation comes into place. It's from the word stagnant and also inflation. It's a combination of inflation and a stagnant economy with the added sort of gift of high unemployment. And that's sarcasm because, of course, it's not a gift, right? So it's inflation and a stagnant economy. Your GDP is down. Your unemployment is up. Your earnings are down and inflation is up. That is stagflation. Your economy isn't moving. How do you fight then inflation and a recession at the same time? It's difficult to do. Unemployment was climbing. It was over 5% at the time of Nixon's resignation. By 1975, it's up to 9%. So it grows, like 4% in just a couple of years. Ford will start a program called WIN, Whip Inflation Now is what it stands for. It meets with pretty limited success. All the while, Ford will be continuing with Nixon's foreign policy practices. He will be the one who signs the Helsinki Accords, although they are negotiated by Nixon. American servicemen continue to engage in a variety of skirmishes that make foreign engagement even less popular with the American people. And so it will lead Americans to think, we need to change. Ford had come in as the vice president to a scandal-ridden administration, and people are looking for someone outside, maybe a political outsider, somebody without ties to the Nixon administration, somebody with different ideas. And so it prompts the turn to Jimmy Carter. So prior to the mid-70s, few Americans outside of Georgia had ever heard of one-time Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. But on Election Day 1976, Americans elect Carter president of the United States. He wins a slim popular majority, receives slightly more than 50% to Ford's 48 in the Electoral College. He wins 297 votes. Both during and after the presidency, Jimmy Carter portrays himself as an average American, a political outsider who will clean up Washington. And that's a refrain that we hear all the time, right? Early in his presidency, Carter proclaims that as much as possible, foreign policy would be guided by a concern for human rights. And I think that that's how we remember Jimmy Carter today. A lot of people remember Jimmy Carter as a bad president, but a great human. I don't know if anybody has heard of him or would agree with that. Even today, what is he, like 98 8 years old or something, and he's still out there building Habitat for Humanity houses. Somebody who didn't always have the most success as a president, though. Carter hoped to make his foreign policy into a tool to end acts of political repression, such as torture, murder, and imprisonment without trial. This policy direction helped reaffirm the position of the United States as a nation of freedom and justice. However, it did undercut the goal of better relations with the Soviet Union, because a lot of times the countries and practices that Carter would call out were Soviet Union countries and practices. So what are some responses, for example, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan? Well, Carter asks the U.S. Senate not to ratify SALT II. He imposes a grain embargo. He calls for the boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. He will also increase aid to Afghan resistance fighters, which, by the way, would be the Taliban. This is when we armed them. Carter, again, will run as an outsider and win a narrow victory in 1976. He will take unsuccessful measures to improve the economy, and he creates some drama when he gives a famous speech known as the Malaise speech, in which he comes across as mad. He's like, come on, guys, start spending money. Why aren't you spending money? Our economy is stagnant. Have a little optimism. And Americans are offended because we say, are you blaming us for the economic problems of the country? So here's a clip of that
crisis
speech.
that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course and has served as a link.
So here's the thing. He comes across as like, have you ever struggled with a concept in school and a teacher told you to just try harder? And it's like, I'm trying hard. I don't understand it, right? He's telling Americans, have more confidence in your economy. And Americans are saying, I don't have money. I'm unemployed. How am I supposed to go spend it? How am I supposed to have confidence? So that's where that controversy comes from. In terms of foreign policy, I already mentioned what his goals would be in terms of human rights. In 1978, he will sign a series of treaties to agree to give the Panama Canal back to Panama in 1999, which does happen. And man, people are angry with him for that, because it's like, are we really giving things away now? He will also have some setbacks with the Soviets. Carter labels the Soviets as human rights abusers, and I mentioned some of those other actions after the Soviets invade Afghanistan. He will also have a controversy when it comes to the Sandinistas, and I think I'll mention that in more detail in just a moment. But Carter's greatest achievement in foreign policy comes in the region that also saw his greatest setback. He helps negotiate a historic peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, but Americans were also being held hostage by Iranian radicals, and he fails to negotiate their release. And as a matter of fact, he does negotiate their release, but they will be released on the day that Reagan is inaugurated. And so Reagan will receive the majority of the credit for that, although it was really a joint effort. And here you see Carter in the middle negotiating these historic Camp David Accords. So I just mentioned that, 1978, Camp David Accords agreement between Israel and Egypt. But the crisis in Iran will be sort of his final political defeat. The U.S. will support the Shah, a leader of Iran who was forced to flee the country in 1979. The new republic in Iran will be led by a religious leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. And in November of 1979, 52 Americans are taken hostage at the U.S. Embassy. Negotiations to get them back fails, rescue attempts fail. The hostages will not be released until 1981, the day that Jimmy Carter leaves office. They spend 444 days in captivity.
In the fall of 1979, protesters broke into the American embassy in Iran, took dozens of people hostage, and kept them there for a long, long time. This was the Iran hostage crisis, an episode that changed the course of American history. Let's take a step back. This hostage crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of several decades of bad blood between the United States and Iran. In 1953, the U.S. helped topple Iran's elected prime minister, replacing him with Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, also known as simply the Shah. The Shah was friendly to the U.S. interests, particularly when it came to oil. The Shah was about as popular in Iran as ants at a picnic. He was a brutal dictator, and his infamous secret police, the Savak, terrorized, tortured, and killed people. Opposition to the Shah grew and grew. In January of 1979, he and his family left Iran on vacation, never to return. By the spring of that year, a religious leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, took power. This is the Iranian Revolution. Khomeini established a new government, an Islamic Republic. This new government, and the young masses who supported it, had no love for the United States. They staged demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran. Trouble was brewing. After leaving Iran, the Shah bounced around from country to country, but after a cancer diagnosis, he wanted to come to the United States to receive the best medical care. President Jimmy Carter didn't want to admit the Shah, but relented under pressure from a group of elder statesmen led by Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller. The Shah arrived at the New York hospital on October 22, 1979. As Carter predicted, giving shelter to the Shah angered the Iranian revolutionaries. A lot. So much so that on November 4th, 1979, a huge mob of protesters attacked the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Knock, knock. Who's there? 3,000 of us, and we're mad as hell. The mob took 63 people at the embassy prisoner. Later, 3 more people were taken hostage at the Iranian Foreign Ministry, bringing the total to 66. 13 days later, the Ayatollah ordered the release of 13 hostages, leaving 53. Another hostage was subsequently released on medical grounds. From then on, the remaining 52 were there for the long haul. They were held in the same embassy complex where they'd once worked. No hostages were killed, but they weren't treated well either. Some were beaten with rubber hoses or hung over elevator shafts. Several men were even victims of a mock execution. Back in the States, the hostage crisis gripped the news cycle.
Iranian militants seized the American embassy in Iran.
The American government demanded the hostages' release, but were rebuffed. The Iranians wanted the Shah shipped to them. No, said the U.S. To drive the point home, the U.S. froze Iranian assets held in American banks. But still, the Iranians didn't budge. In April of 1980, President Carter decided to try something different. He authorized a military rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw. But poor weather and mechanical failures doomed the mission, leaving America and the Carter administration embarrassed on the world stage. Carter was in an election, and his opponent, Ronald Reagan, pounced on him for being weak and ineffective.
Frankly, I don't think the president has done anything that he couldn't have done 5 months ago.
When Election Day rolled around, the hostages were still being held captive with no end in sight. Reagan trounced Carter at the polls. By the start of 1981, the Iranian government began to feel the pressure from the international community to release the hostages. The Iranians and Americans went back to the bargaining table. In exchange for lifting the embargo, Iran agreed to release their prisoners. Just hours after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981, the American hostages were freed from captivity. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days. It was a bruising period for the United States and for President Carter. And the ugly market left on relations between the United States and Iran lingers to this day.
Okay, so the social and cultural changes that had been started in the 1950s and 60s continued unabated in the 1970s. As a result, by the end of the decade, the U.S. was a very different society than the one it had been a generation earlier. These differences gave rise to an ongoing debate about the nation's values. People are even living in different places. Many people are migrating to the Sun Belt, right? Air conditioning had long been a factor down south, and so you start to see a lot of people moving. And to finish with this image here, this is the me decade of the 1970s. Americans develop a growing interest in improving their health and overall level of fitness. So just to go back here, all of this is related, right? This OPEC crisis, I'm just going to leave it here. This OPEC crisis with Carter in the Middle East and the oil embargo is all tied to the anti-communism containment strategy of supporting the brutal Shah, which is tied to the taking of U.S. hostages. All this is going to contribute to the rise of Ronald Reagan also in the 80s. So to be continued. Well, in the next chapter at least.